Blood stained the crushed velvet of the carriage interior, a stark contrast to the pale, dirt-streaked face of Leopold Somerset, the Duke of Westmoreland. When the splintered wheels finally settled in the muddy ditch of the Derbyshire countryside, fate offered him a choice: wake up and face the cold, crumbling ruins of his arranged marriage, or close his eyes and discover the terrifying truth. He chose the darkness. By feigning a deep coma, Leopold intended to unmask a gold-digging traitor. Instead, lying motionless in his gilded bedchamber, he uncovered a web of treacherous deceit so profound, it made him question who the true villain of his marriage actually was. Splintering wood and the terrified shrieks of horses were the last things Leopold Somerset heard before the world flipped violently. The Duke of Westmoreland's carriage, a heavy, gilded behemoth of oak and iron, had been forced off the treacherous cliffside road just outside the boundaries of his ancestral estate. When Leopold finally dragged himself back to consciousness, the metallic taste of blood coated his tongue. He was slumped against the ruined carriage door, his shoulder throbbing with a dull, vicious ache, and a shallow gash across his temple bleeding sluggishly into his collar. Yet, as he meticulously flexed his fingers and tested his legs, a startling realization washed over him. He was largely intact. There were no crushed bones, no fatal internal hemorrhages. He had survived what should have been a devastating plunge with little more than severe bruising and a concussion. He was about to kick the shattered door open and call for his driver when a dark, bitter thought rooted him to the spot. For months, poison had been dripping into his ear regarding his wife, Cecilia. Their marriage had been an arrangement of high society, her family's old lineage combined with his vast wealth. Lately, however, Leopold had found strange letters in his study, half-burned missives bearing the crest of his cousin, Viscount Edmund Carlisle. There were whispers in the drawing rooms of London, subtle glances exchanged between Cecilia and Edmund at winter balls. Leopold had convinced himself that his wife was merely waiting for him to step out of the picture so she could abscond with his cousin and his fortune. As the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed down the foggy road, a desperate, almost mad idea took hold of his bruised mind. What better way to test the loyalty of a wife than to present her with a husband who was practically a corpse? The first to arrive was Dr. Horace Arbuthnot, a local physician whose discretion Leopold had purchased on more than one occasion in his reckless youth. When the doctor climbed down into the ditch, bag in hand, Leopold seized the older man by the lapels of his coat. "Listen to me, Horace," Leopold hissed, his voice raw but steady. "I am alive. I am well, but when they carry me up to the estate, you will tell my wife and my cousin that I have suffered a catastrophic injury to the brain. You will tell them I am in a deep, waking slumber, and that I may never return to my senses." Dr. Arbuthnot blinked, his face paling. "Your Grace, this is madness. The Duchess will be beside herself. The legal ramifications for the estate—" "I will double your yearly stipend," Leopold interrupted, his eyes flashing with a dangerous, feverish light. £500, Horace. Right now, in my coat pocket. Take it and declare me dead to the world, save for my breathing. I must know what happens in my halls when I am no longer watching." Reluctance waged war with greed in the doctor's eyes, but eventually, greed won. By the time the footman from the estate arrived with a stretcher, Leopold had let his limbs go entirely limp. He allowed his eyes to roll back, slackening his jaw, entering a performance that would require every ounce of his willpower. The journey back to the manor was an agonizing test of endurance. Leopold felt every jolt, every rock in the road, but he remained a ragdoll. When he was finally carried through the grand oak doors of the manor, the heavy scent of beeswax and imported lilies filled his nostrils. He heard the chaotic flurry of footsteps, the panicked shouting of the butler, and then, cutting through the din, the sharp, terrified gasp of Cecilia. Leopold, her voice cracked, devoid of the icy composure she usually wore like armor. He was carried up the grand staircase and laid upon the massive four-poster bed in the master suite. Doctor. Arbuthnot played his part perfectly, his tone appropriately grave. "A terrible swelling of the brain, Your Grace," the doctor murmured to Cecilia. "He breathes, but his mind is trapped in the dark. He feels no pain, but he hears nothing. He sees nothing. We can only pray, but you must prepare yourself for the worst." Leopold lay perfectly still, controlling his breathing, making it slow, deep, and rhythmic. He waited for the doctor to leave, waited for the servants to be dismissed. He braced himself for Cecilia's reaction, expecting a sigh of relief, perhaps even a cold laugh. He expected her to immediately send for Edmund. Instead, the heavy oak door clicked shut, and absolute silence fell over the room. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, Leopold felt a shift in the mattress. The rustle of a heavy silk gown sounded right beside his ear. A warm, trembling hand brushed the hair away from his bloodied temple. A choked, desperate sob broke the silence. Hot tears splashed against Leopold's cheek. "You foolish, arrogant man." Cecilia wept, her voice entirely stripped of its usual aristocratic polish. "You cannot leave me. Do you hear me, Leopold? You cannot leave me alone in this viper's nest." Beneath the heavy linen sheets, Leopold's heart gave a violent, treacherous leap. This was not the reaction of a woman eager for her husband's demise. But he dared not move. The game had only just begun. For the next 48 hours, Leopold's existence was a waking purgatory. The physical toll of playing a comatose man was excruciating, his muscles seized with agonizing cramps that he could only attempt to relieve in the dead of night, moving mere millimeters at a time when he was absolutely certain the room was empty. His skin itched furiously. The smell of medicinal poultices and camphor, slathered onto his chest by well-meaning servants, made him nauseous. But the physical discomfort paled in comparison to the psychological torment of his self-imposed sensory deprivation. Behind his closed eyelids, the world was reduced to sounds, smells, and the subtle shifts in air pressure when someone entered the room. Cecilia rarely left his side. He recognized her presence by the faint scent of jasmine and the soft, rhythmic clicking of her knitting needles. She spoke to him often, her voice a low, soothing murmur that contradicted every cold interaction they had shared over the past 2 years. She read him poetry, Keats and Byron, and sometimes she simply sat and held his hand, her thumb tracing the knuckles of his lifeless fingers. Why? Leopold screamed in the confines of his own mind. Why perform this farce when no one is watching? The answer arrived on the afternoon of the 3rd day, accompanied by the heavy, arrogant tread of leather riding boots. "Cecilia, my dear," came the slick, velvet voice of Viscount Edmund Carlisle. Leopold's jaw tightened instinctively, but he forced his facial muscles to remain slack. He felt Cecilia immediately stiffen beside the bed, dropping her knitting into her lap. "Edmund," she said, her voice dropping 20 degrees. "I told the butler I was receiving no visitors. Especially not you. Now, is that any way to speak to family in a time of crisis?" Edmund's footsteps circled the bed. Leopold could feel the man's shadow fall across his face. Poor Leopold. Arbuthnot tells me it is a miracle his heart still beats. Though, perhaps miracle is the wrong word. It seems cruel to prolong this vegetative state. "Get out of my bedchamber," Cecilia hissed, the venom in her tone startling Leopold. This was not the secret lover he had envisioned. "You are distraught, Cecilia." "I understand," Edmund replied, his tone dripping with patronizing sympathy. "But we must be pragmatic. The Westmoreland estate cannot run itself. The mills in the north, the tenant farms, the shipping contracts. They require a firm hand, a man's hand. I've already taken the liberty of contacting Leopold's solicitors. As his closest male relative, I am prepared to step in as steward until the inevitable occurs." Under the blankets, Leopold's hands curled into fists. He wanted to sit up, to wrap his hands around Edmund's throat and choke the life out of him. The letters he had found in his study, the ones hinting at an affair, suddenly took on a terrifying new context. They weren't evidence of infidelity. They were a planted distraction. "You will do no such thing," Cecilia said, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor as she stood up to face him. "Leopold's affairs are perfectly managed. By me." Edmund let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. "You? A duchess playing with ledgers? Don't be absurd, Cecilia. You don't understand the first thing about the debts this estate is drowning in. Do you think Leopold's little gambling habits in London went unnoticed? The estate is leveraged to the hilt. Without my intervention, the banks will seize everything within the month." Leopold felt a cold dread wash over him. Debts. He had no debts. The Westmoreland fortune was one of the most secure in the empire. What was Edmund talking about? "I am fully aware of the forged promissory notes you have been circulating." "Edmund," Cecilia's voice was dangerously calm, carrying the lethal grace of a drawn blade. "I have spent the last 6 months untangling the web of embezzlement you set up during Leopold's trips to the continent. You thought him too aloof to notice, and you thought me too foolish to check the accounts." Silence descended on the room, heavy and suffocating. Leopold's mind reeled. She knew? She had been protecting him? "You are playing a dangerous game, little girl." Edmund's voice dropped its charming veneer, revealing a threatening growl. Leopold heard the rustle of fabric, followed by a sharp intake of breath from Cecilia. Edmund had grabbed her arm. Leopold's eyes fluttered beneath his lids. Every instinct screamed at him to break the ruse, to leap from the bed and shatter Edmund's jaw. "Unhand me," Cecilia commanded, her voice steady despite the physical threat. "Or I shall scream, and the footman will throw you from the highest window of this manor. Leopold may be asleep, but I am the Duchess of Westmoreland, and while I draw breath, you will not touch one copper penny of his legacy. Now, leave." A tense eternity passed. Finally, Edmund released her with a scoff. "Enjoy playing the martyr, Cecilia, but he is a corpse breathing stolen air. When he stops, I will be back, and you will have nothing." The heavy door slammed shut. Cecilia collapsed back into her chair, her breathing ragged. She leaned over Leopold, burying her face in his chest, her tears soaking through his sleeping shirt. "Wake up, Leopold," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please. I am holding the walls up as best I can, but I cannot fight him alone. Please come back to me." Leopold lay trapped in his self-made prison of silence, a single, silent tear escaping the corner of his closed eye. He had played a trick to catch a traitor, only to discover the finest, fiercest woman he had ever known had been fighting a war for him in the shadows. The grandfather clock in the corner of the room ticked away the hours, each rhythmic pendulum swing striking like a hammer against Leopold's frayed nerves. It was the deep, unforgiving middle of the night, the hour when the grand manor settled into an eerie quiet, leaving Leopold alone with the crushing weight of his realization. The ruse had grown from a bitter test of fidelity into a horrifying trap. If he miraculously awoke now, he would have to explain his deception. He would have to admit to Cecilia that he had doubted her, that he had believed the vile whispers of society and his cousin over her character. The shame of it threatened to suffocate him. Yet, lying here as a spectator while she fought wolves at the door was an even greater cowardice. Around 2 in the morning, the heavy oak door creaked open, its hinges protesting softly. Leopold instantly regulated his breathing, dropping his chin slightly toward his chest. Soft, rapid footsteps padded across the Persian rug. It wasn't the heavy tread of the night nurse, nor the hesitant step of a servant. It was Cecilia. She didn't come to the bedside immediately. Instead, Leopold heard the scrape of a key turning in the lock of his heavy mahogany writing desk, a desk he kept strictly off limits. He heard the rustle of heavy parchment, the clinking of coins, and the unmistakable snap of a velvet jewelry box being opened. "Martha," Cecilia whispered urgently. Another set of footsteps entered the room, lighter, hesitant. Martha, Cecilia's personal maid and fiercest confidant. "Your Grace," Martha murmured, her voice tight with worry. "You shouldn't be up. You haven't slept in days." "There is no time for sleep, Martha," Cecilia replied, her voice thrumming with nervous energy. "Edmund is moving faster than I anticipated. He has already filed an injunction with the magistrates in London to seize the northern coal revenues, claiming Leopold is unfit, and I am not legally authorized. But the ledgers, Your Grace, you've proven the debts are fraudulent. Proving it to myself and proving it to a magistrate bribed by Edmund are two different things." Cecilia sighed, a sound of profound exhaustion. Leopold heard the sliding of heavy objects across the desk. "Take this, Your Grace. This is the Wentworth sapphire necklace. It's a family heirloom. It was your mother's. It is a heavy rock that does me no good locked in a box," Cecilia said sharply. "Take it to Mr. Fiennes in the village before dawn. Tell him I need the cash immediately. Edmund has bought off the captain of the guards and half the estate staff. If I don't pay them their back wages by tomorrow, they will let Edmund walk right through the front door and change the lock." Leopold felt a physical pain in his chest, sharper than the bruised ribs from the accident. His staff? Bribed? His estate wages in arrears? How deeply had Edmund buried his claws into the Westmoreland holdings while Leopold had been drinking port and complaining about London society? "It shouldn't be like this," Martha sniffled. "The Duke, he didn't appreciate you, Your Grace. He was cold. He believed the rumors about you and the Viscount. We all knew he did. Why are you destroying your own inheritance to save his?" Leopold waited, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He desperately needed to hear the answer. There was a long pause. When Cecilia spoke, her voice was startlingly gentle. "Because he is a fool, Martha," Cecilia whispered. "A guarded, stubborn fool who was raised in a world that taught him everyone has a price. He thought I married him for the title. He thought Edmund was his loyal blood. He was wrong on both accounts." Leopold felt the soft pressure of Cecilia's hand on his. "I didn't marry a title," she continued softly. "I married the man who, 3 years ago, spent an entire rainy afternoon in my father's library debating philosophy with me, treating me as an equal when no other man in society would. I saw who he really was beneath the arrogance. He just forgot how to be that man. And I will not let Edmund destroy his legacy while he lies here defenseless. I will fight for him, even if he never wakes up to thank me." Tears, hot and unbidden, burned behind Leopold's tightly shut eyelids. He had been a blind, monumental idiot. He had locked himself in a fortress of cynicism, shutting out the one person who had actually seen him. "Go, Martha," Cecilia instructed. "Hurry." As the maid slipped out of the room, Cecilia returned to the side of the bed. She slumped into the chair, the exhaustion finally overtaking her posture. She laid her head down on the edge of the mattress, her fingers lightly resting on Leopold's forearm. Within minutes, her breathing deepened, giving way to the heavy sleep of the utterly depleted. Leopold slowly, agonizingly, opened his eyes. The room was bathed in the soft, silver glow of the moonlight streaming through the velvet curtains. He looked down at his wife. The moonlight caught the dark circles under her eyes, the pale, drawn look of her cheeks. She looked fragile, yet he knew she possessed a strength that dwarfed his own. He carefully turned his hand over, ignoring the stiff protest of his muscles, and gently intertwined his fingers with hers. He couldn't keep this charade up any longer. He needed to wake up. He needed to rise from this bed, summon the local magistrate, and rain absolute hellfire down upon Edmund Carlyle. But as he prepared to squeeze her hand and softly speak her name, the sound of heavy boots echoed from the hallway outside. It wasn't the slow pacing of a night guard. It was purposeful, heavy, and accompanied by the metallic clinking of keys. The handle of the bedchamber door began to turn. Leopold instantly snapped his eyes shut, his muscles locking back into rigid paralysis. He let his breathing shallow out just as the heavy door swung open, casting a long, dark shadow across the foot of the bed. "I told you, Carlyle," a gruff, unfamiliar voice whispered from the doorway. "The Duchess is in there." "Then we will handle her too," came Edmund's icy reply. "The carriage is waiting out back. Bind her, gag her, and put her inside. As for my dear cousin, a pillow over the face should be enough. Dr. Arbuthnot is already prepared to sign the death certificate." Leopold's blood turned to ice. The game of observation was over. The fight for survival had just begun. The heavy oak door of the master suite swung fully open, its iron hinges groaning a protest that sounded like a death knell in the silent room. Through the sliver of his eyelashes, Leopold watched the encroaching darkness. Two silhouettes stepped over the threshold, blocking the pale moonlight that spilled from the corridor. One was Viscount Edmund Carlyle, his posture relaxed, exuding the smug confidence of a man who believed he had already won the war. The other was a hulking brute of a man, smelling distinctly of stale gin, chewing tobacco, and wet wool. "Make it quick, O'Bannon," Edmund whispered, his voice devoid of any familial warmth or human empathy. "The Duchess first. Bind her wrists. If she wakes and screams, hit her. I don't care about bruises. I will simply tell the magistrate she became hysterical with grief and had to be restrained for her own safety. I will deal with my dear cousin." O'Bannon grunted an affirmative, pulling a coil of rough hemp rope from his heavy coat. He moved toward the chair where Cecilia lay, slumped in exhaustion, her head resting on the edge of Leopold's mattress. Simultaneously, Edmund stepped toward the headboard. Leopold heard the faint rustle of feathers as his cousin picked up the heavy, velvet-trimmed spare pillow from the settee beside the bed. Every muscle in Leopold's body, stiff and aching from 3 days of forced paralysis, screamed in anticipation. Adrenaline, cold and electric, flooded his veins, sweeping away the lethargy. He calculated the distance, the timing, the exact moment he would need to strike. He could not afford a mistake. If he failed, Cecilia would be at the mercy of a monster. Edmund loomed over him, the shadow of the pillow blocking out the ceiling. "Goodbye, Leopold," Edmund sneered softly. "You never did appreciate what you had. I will make much better use of it." As the pillow descended, aiming to smother the life from him, Leopold's eyes snapped wide open. He didn't just move, he exploded upward. His right hand, driven by pure, primal fury, shot out from beneath the linen sheets and clamped around Edmund's throat with the force of a steel vice. Edmund's eyes bulged in absolute, unadulterated terror. A strangled, pathetic gasp escaped his lips as the pillow dropped uselessly to the floor. For a fraction of a second, the Viscount stared into the blazing, thoroughly conscious eyes of the man he thought was a vegetable, his mind failing to process the impossible resurrection. "I appreciate her perfectly well, you treacherous bastard," Leopold snarled. Using his rigid legs, Leopold planted his feet against Edmund's chest and kicked outward with every ounce of strength he possessed. The Viscount flew backward, crashing violently into a heavy mahogany washstand. Ceramic pitchers and basins shattered into 100 pieces, sending water and porcelain flying across the Persian rug. The deafening crash jolted Cecilia awake. She gasped, shooting up from her chair, her eyes wide with disorientation. O'Bannon, startled by the sudden violence, lunged toward Cecilia, his massive hands reaching for her throat to silence her scream. Leopold didn't hesitate. He threw off the heavy blankets and launched himself across the bed. His legs, weakened from disuse, nearly gave out beneath him, but the sheer momentum of his dive carried him directly into O'Bannon's midsection. The two men crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs. O'Bannon was heavier, a brawler hired from the darkest taverns of London, and he quickly rolled, pinning Leopold beneath his immense weight. A meaty fist pulled back and slammed into Leopold's jaw, snapping his head back against the floorboards. White-hot pain exploded behind Leopold's eyes, threatening to drag him back into the darkness he had just escaped. "Leopold!" Cecilia screamed, a sound of pure, piercing terror. O'Bannon drew back his fist for a second, lethal blow. But before it could land, a heavy, solid crack echoed through the room. O'Bannon's eyes rolled back into his head, and he slumped forward, dead weight, trapping Leopold beneath him. Standing over the brute, chest heaving and hands trembling violently, was Cecilia. She held the heavy brass base of a candelabra, wielding it like a club. Leopold shoved the unconscious thug off his chest, gasping for air, rubbing his bruised jaw. He looked up at his wife. She was pale as a ghost, her hair wildly disheveled, the brass candelabra slipping from her slick fingers to thud against the floor. He turned his head toward the washstand. Edmund was gone. The door to the hallway stood wide open, the Viscount having fled like a coward the moment the tide turned. Silence descended upon the room once more, broken only by the ragged breathing of the Duke and Duchess. Cecilia stared at Leopold. She looked at his legs, supporting his weight as he pushed himself up. She looked at his chest, rising and falling rapidly. She looked at his eyes, sharp, alert, and entirely present. The candelabra was forgotten. The danger of Edmund fleeing into the night was momentarily erased. There was only the shattering realization dawning in Cecilia's eyes. "You?" she whispered, her voice trembling, stepping backward as if he were an apparition. "You are awake." Leopold swallowed hard, the metallic taste of blood returning to his mouth. "Cecilia, when?" she demanded, the whisper turning into a sharp, brittle crack. Her eyes darted to the bed, to the medical bandages, and back to his face. "When did you wake up, Leopold?" There was nowhere to hide. No more ruses to play. "I never slept," Leopold confessed, the words tasting like ash. "Since the ditch, Cecilia, I have been awake the entire time." The silence that followed Leopold's confession was heavier than the heavy velvet curtains drawn across the windows. It was a suffocating, atmospheric pressure that threatened to crush the remaining air from his lungs. Cecilia did not scream. She did not weep. Instead, a terrifying, icy stillness settled over her features. She walked slowly toward him, her slippered feet stepping over the unconscious body of O'Bannon, crunching over the broken porcelain of the washstand. When she was close enough to feel the heat radiating from his skin, she raised her hand and struck him across the face. The slap was a crack of thunder in the quiet room. It held the force of 3 days of absolute terror, grief, and exhaustion. Leopold's head snapped to the side, his cheek instantly burning with a fierce, red imprint of her hand. He did not raise his hand to touch it. He stood perfectly still, accepting the blow, knowing he deserved 100 more. "You let me weep," Cecilia said, her voice dropping to a low, lethal vibration. "You let me sit by that bed, holding a lifeless hand, begging God to return my husband to me. You let me sell my mother's sapphires. You laid there, listening to Edmund threaten me, and you did nothing." "I did it to protect you," Leopold pleaded, stepping forward, his hands raised in supplication. "Or, at least, I thought I was. Cecilia, please understand. The letters, the whispers, in London. Edmund planted seeds of doubt in my mind. He made me believe you were conspiring with him to bleed the estate dry. So you decided to play dead to see if I would dance on your grave." She laughed, a harsh, bitter sound, devoid of any humor. "How arrogant, how utterly, deeply pathetic of you, Leopold. You trusted the whispers of a known scoundrel over the character of the woman you share a bed with. You wanted to test me? Well, congratulations, Your Grace. You passed your own sick trial, and in doing so, you have broken whatever fragile bond we had left." Tears, hot and angry, finally spilled over her lower lashes, tracing paths through the dust and stress on her face. She turned her back to him, wrapping her arms around her own waist, trembling violently. Leopold felt a chasm open beneath his feet. He had survived the carriage wreck. He had survived Edmund's assassination attempt. But looking at his wife's trembling back, he realized he was watching the death of his marriage. "I was a fool," he said, his voice cracking, stripping away every ounce of his aristocratic pride. He dropped to his knees behind her, uncaring of the bruised joints and the cold floor. "I was a blind, cynical fool. But I heard what you said to Martha. I heard you fight for me. You fought for a man you thought was cold and unappreciative because you remembered who I used to be. You saved my legacy, Cecilia. And tonight, you saved my life." He gently reached out, catching the hem of her silk dressing gown. "Hate me tomorrow. Despise me for the rest of our lives if you must. But please, let me make this right. Edmund has fled, but he has not surrendered. He has the estate guards. He has Dr. Arbuthnot. The moment he realizes I am alive, he will not try a pillow. He will return with a dozen armed men and claim I attacked you in a fit of brain-fevered madness." Cecilia stiffened. The harsh reality of their situation pierced through the fog of her righteous anger. She swiped the tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand and turned to look down at him. "He holds the keys to the armory," Cecilia stated, her analytical mind immediately seizing on the tactical nightmare. "He has paid off the captain of the guard. If we step out into that hallway, we are dead." "Not if we don't use the hallway," Leopold said, rising to his feet, a dangerous, calculating fire returning to his eyes. He strode past the massive four-poster bed toward the far wall, dominated by a gargantuan, floor-to-ceiling mahogany armoire that held Cecilia's winter cloaks. "Help me move this," Leopold commanded, gripping the heavy brass handles. Cecilia didn't question him. The anger was still there, a simmering coal in her eyes, but she pressed her shoulder against the polished wood. Together, with a synchronized groan of effort, they shoved the massive piece of furniture to the left. The iron casters squealed against the hardwood floor. Behind the armoire, hidden by the shadows and a layer of ancient dust, was a narrow, arched wooden door cut seamlessly into the oak paneling. "The architect who built this wing in the 16th century was a paranoid Catholic," Leopold explained, pulling a heavy brass key from a hidden compartment within the armoire's base. "There is a network of priest holes and servant passages that run between the walls. They lead straight down to the cellars and out to the stables. Edmund knows the ledgers, but he does not know the bones of this house." He unlocked the hidden door, revealing a pitch-black, narrow corridor that smelled of dry rot and old masonry. He grabbed a lit candelabra from the mantelpiece. "What about him?" Cecilia pointed to the massive, snoring form of O'Bannon on the rug. "We leave him," Leopold said coldly. "When Edmund returns and finds his assassin unconscious and the room empty, he will panic. He will assume we have fled into the night. We need him to think he has won, just for a few hours. We need him to step into the light so we can cut him down." Leopold extended his hand toward the dark passage. "Duchess." Cecilia looked at his outstretched hand, then at his bruised face. She ignored his hand, lifting her silk skirts, and stepped past him into the darkness of the hidden passage. "Lead the way, Your Grace," she said coldly, "and pray you do not stumble again." The air inside the hidden passages was suffocating, thick with centuries of undisturbed dust and the sharp tang of old stone. Leopold led the way, holding the flickering candelabra high, the shadows dancing grotesquely against the narrow, vaulted ceilings. Cecilia followed close behind, her breathing shallow, the rustle of her silk gown the only sound masking the frantic beating of their hearts. For 20 minutes, they navigated a labyrinth of steep, winding wooden staircases and narrow corridors that squeezed the breath from their lungs. Occasionally, they passed small, slatted wooden vents that offered glimpses into the rooms below. As they crept above the grand entrance hall, the sound of raised voices drifted up through the floorboards. Leopold pressed his eye to a slat, holding his breath. Below, the grand foyer was brilliantly lit. Edmund stood at the foot of the sweeping marble staircase, surrounded by half a dozen heavily armed estate guards. Dr. Arbuthnot was hovering nervously near the door, clutching his medical bag like a shield. "The Duke is dead," Edmund's voice bellowed, echoing off the high ceilings, laced with a perfectly feigned theatrical grief. He succumbed to his injuries in the night. And the horror of it, the absolute tragedy. It broke the Duchess's mind. "She attacked my man, O'Bannon, in a fit of hysteria and fled into the woods." Cecilia gasped, softly beside Leopold in the dark, her hand covering her mouth. "Lock down the perimeter," Edmund ordered the guards, his voice hardening into absolute authority. "No one enters or leaves the grounds. Find the Duchess. For her own safety, she must be apprehended and brought to my quarters. Dr. Arbuthnot, you will prepare the death certificate immediately. I must take control of the seal and the accounts before dawn, lest the estate fall into chaos." Leopold felt a murderous rage boil in his gut. Edmund was moving flawlessly, sealing the trap. By morning, Leopold would be legally dead, Cecilia would be committed to an asylum, and Edmund would own the entirety of Derbyshire. "We have to reach the stables," Leopold whispered, pulling away from the vent. "Lord Alistair Covington's estate is only 5 miles east. He is the regional magistrate. He owes his position on the bench to my father's patronage, and he despises Edmund. If we can get a message to him, he can ride here with the king's dragoons before breakfast." They hurried down the final, perilous flight of stairs, emerging into the damp, freezing air of the root cellar. Pushing past barrels of salted pork and bins of winter potatoes, they finally reached the heavy iron door that opened to the rear courtyard, just 50 yards from the main stables. Leopold slowly pushed the door open. The courtyard was bathed in moonlight, but thankfully, empty. The guards were likely searching the perimeter walls or the woods, just as Edmund had ordered. They sprinted across the cobblestones, slipping through the side entrance of the massive stone stables. The warm smell of hay, leather, and horses enveloped them. A startled gasp came from the far corner. A young man, barely 20, dropped a pitchfork, his eyes wide as saucers. It was Finnegan, the head groom, a boy who had practically been raised in the Westmoreland stables. Lord Almighty, Finnegan crossed himself, his face draining of all color as he stared at Leopold. They said you was dead, Your Grace. The Viscount, he said you passed on. I am very much alive, Finnegan, Leopold said, stepping into the lantern light to prove his corporeality. But if you do not help us, I will be dead before the sun rises. Finnegan looked from the bruised, dirt-streaked Duke to the disheveled Duchess, his loyalty warring with his fear. The guards. They've locked the main gates, Your Grace. No carriages can get out. I don't need a carriage, Leopold said, quickly pulling his heavy gold signet ring, the seal of Westmoreland, from his finger. He pressed it into Finnegan's trembling hand. I need a fast rider on a fast horse. Take my midnight stallion, Eclipse. He can jump the low stone wall behind the orchards. Ride to Lord Covington's estate. Show him this ring. Tell him the Duke of Westmoreland requires his immediate presence, and to bring every armed man he can muster. Finnegan swallowed hard, looking at the heavy gold ring. And what will you do, Your Grace? Leopold looked back toward the towering silhouette of the manor, its windows glowing with candlelight like the eyes of a beast. A cold, dangerous smile touched the corners of his mouth. Edmund has declared me a ghost, Leopold murmured, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. I think it is time I start haunting my own halls. He wants to play psychological warfare with my wife. Let us see how his own mind fares when the dead come back to settle their accounts. He turned to Cecilia, whose eyes were wide, realizing the sheer, reckless audacity of his plan. Go with Finnegan, Leopold ordered her gently. Hide in the hayloft until Covington arrives. You will be safe there. No, Cecilia said, her voice ringing with absolute, unyielding defiance. She stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with him. The anger from the bedroom was still there, but it was now forged into something harder, a weapon they could wield together. He is stealing my home, too. If we are going to haunt the bastard, we do it together. Leopold looked at her, truly seeing the magnificent, terrifying woman he had married. For the first time in 3 years, he felt a genuine, overwhelming surge of love, untainted by doubt or aristocratic protocol. Very well, Duchess, Leopold said, offering her his arm. Let us go ruin my cousin's night. The labyrinthine skeleton of the Westmoreland estate was a masterpiece of 16th-century paranoia, built by an ancestor who feared the executioner's block more than he feared drafts. As Leopold and Cecilia navigated the cramped, pitch-black corridors running parallel to the grand hallways, the air grew thick with the metallic scent of old brass and damp masonry. The library, Cecilia whispered, her voice barely carrying over the scuff of their shoes against the rough-hewn floorboards. If Edmund wants the seal and the accounts consolidated before dawn, he will have set up a command post there, and he will have kept Arbuthnot close to sign the necessary legal fictions. Leopold nodded in the darkness, admiring the terrifying, pragmatic speed of his wife's mind. Doctor, Arbuthnot is a coward who loves coins more than his own soul, but he possesses no stomach for actual warfare. If we break the doctor, Edmund's legal claim shatters. They ascended a narrow spiral of stone steps that made Cecilia's calves burn, finally reaching a heavy oak panel situated directly behind the grand bookcases of the main library. Leopold felt for the iron latch, sliding a viewing slat open by a mere fraction of an inch. Warm, golden candlelight spilled into their hidden enclave. Through the narrow gap, they had a perfect vantage point of the sprawling, leather-bound room. Dr. Horace Arbuthnot sat at Leopold's massive mahogany desk, his thinning hair plastered to his forehead with nervous sweat. A snifter of Leopold's finest French brandy sat half-empty at his elbow. The doctor's hands trembled violently as he dipped a silver quill into an inkwell, pausing over a thick, cream-colored parchment bearing the royal watermark. The death certificate. Edmund was pacing near the grand fireplace, his riding crop slapping rhythmically against his high leather boots. Sign it, Horace, and be done with it, Edmund snapped, the veneer of aristocratic charm entirely stripped away, revealing the desperate, snarling animal beneath. The longer you dither, the more time the Duchess has to reach the village. If she finds a sympathetic ear before this is lodged with the magistrate's courier, we will both hang. I am a man of medicine, Viscount, Arbuthnot stammered, his voice reedy and high-pitched. I have falsified ailments for the Duke's gambling retreats, yes, but this is declaring a peer of the realm dead. This is treason if discovered. And the brute, O'Bannon. He was supposed to return an hour ago. O'Bannon is likely burying the Duchess in a shallow grave in the orchards, exactly as I paid him to do. Edmund lied smoothly, though Leopold could see the muscle ticking furiously in his cousin's jaw. Edmund poured himself a generous measure of brandy. Sign the parchment. You will leave this estate with £5,000, Horace. Enough to buy a practice in London and forget the name Westmoreland entirely. Behind the wall, Leopold felt Cecilia's hand grip his forearm. Her fingers were ice cold, her breath catching at the casual mention of her ordered murder. Leopold covered her hand with his own, his thumb tracing her knuckles in a silent promise of retribution. He needs a push, Leopold murmured, his lips brushing Cecilia's ear. The architect who built this house installed copper speaking tubes to eavesdrop on the servants. There is an intake funnel just above the mantelpiece, and the output is directly behind the grating at Arbuthnot's feet. Leopold moved a few paces to his left, running his hands over the dusty brickwork until he found the flared, trumpet-like opening of the copper tube. He took a slow, deep breath, letting the anger, the betrayal, and the chill of the catacombs seep into his vocal cords. He leaned into the funnel. 30 pieces of silver, Horace, Leopold whispered. The acoustics of the copper tube amplified and distorted his voice, stripping it of its humanity, turning it into a hollow, disembodied echo that seemed to rise directly from the floorboards of the library. In the room below, Dr. Arbuthnot froze. The silver quill slipped from his trembling fingers, splattering black ink across the pristine death certificate. Did you hear that? Arbuthnot gasped, his eyes darting wildly around the empty corners of the vast room. Edmund frowned, pausing his pacing. Hear what? The wind in the chimney? Stop, acting like a frightened scullery maid, and finish the signature. Leopold waited for the silence to stretch, pulling the tension tighter. He leaned into the tube again, lowering his pitch to a gravelly, sepulchral scrape. You pronounced me dead, Horace. But the grave is so very cold, and I require company. Arbuthnot shrieked a high, undignified sound of absolute, primal terror. He shoved his heavy leather chair backward, scrambling away from the desk. It is him! The Duke! His spirit is in the floorboards. Have you gone entirely mad? Edmund roared, striding across the room and grabbing the doctor by the lapels of his coat. There are no ghosts, you imbecile. It is the wind. No, Arbuthnot sobbed, struggling against the Viscount's grip. I heard him. He knows what we've done. The blood money is cursed, Edmund. Cursed. Beside Leopold, Cecilia pulled a heavy iron lever mounted on the wall. It was connected to the intricate system of flue dampers. With a grinding screech of hidden gears, the massive iron damper in the library fireplace slammed shut. The sudden change in air pressure caused the flames in the hearth to violently snuff out, plunging half the room into thick, suffocating smoke and deep shadow. Simultaneously, Leopold reached through a secondary panel meant for the servants to secretly refill the oil lamps. With a swift puff of breath, he extinguished the 2 candelabras nearest to the desk. The library was suddenly plunged into near-total darkness, illuminated only by the frantic, dying embers in the choked fireplace. Arbuthnot broke. He tore himself free from Edmund's grasp, leaving a piece of his coat behind. God have mercy on my soul, the doctor screamed, abandoning the death certificate, his medical bag, and his promised fortune. He bolted for the heavy double doors, throwing them open and sprinting down the corridor, his frantic footsteps echoing into the night. Horace, come back here, you spineless worm. Edmund bellowed into the darkness, drawing a silver-handled flintlock pistol from his coat. But the doctor was gone. Edmund stood alone in the dim, smoky library, his chest heaving. The Viscount raised his pistol, aiming it at the shadows, his bravado finally cracking under the weight of the inexplicable. Show yourself, he shouted, his voice trembling at the edges. If someone is there, I will put a bullet through your heart. Through the viewing slat, Leopold smiled a cold, terrifying expression that belonged to a predator. He turned to Cecilia. The doctor is broken, Leopold whispered. Now, we break the garrison. Panic is a contagion, and in the isolated, shadow-drenched halls of the Westmoreland estate, it spread with the speed of a wildfire. Doctor, Arbuthnot's hysterical flight through the corridors had infected the mercenary guards Edmund had stationed at the doors. The doctor had barreled past them, screaming of ghosts, curses, and dead dukes, seeking vengeance, before throwing himself onto his carriage and whipping his horses into a frenzied gallop down the gravel drive. Leopold and Cecilia moved with lethal precision through the hidden arteries of the manor. They became phantoms. When a pair of guards patrolled the east gallery, Cecilia dropped a heavy iron chandelier to the floor below them using a maintenance winch, sending the men scrambling in terror. When the corrupt captain of the guard retreated to the kitchens to pour himself a stiff drink, Leopold used the servant's dumbwaiter to send down a silver platter bearing a single, blood-stained linen bandage from his own head wound. By 3 a.m, discipline had entirely collapsed. Half of Edmund's hired muscle had abandoned their posts, refusing to patrol the dark corridors of a house that seemed actively trying to kill them. Edmund was losing control, and he knew it. Leopold and Cecilia had repositioned themselves above the grand entrance hall, peering down through the intricately carved wooden balustrades of the mezzanine. Below, chaos reigned. The massive oak front doors were bolted shut from the inside, a desperate attempt by the remaining guards to keep out whatever horrors they believed were lurking in the night. Edmund stood in the center of the foyer, his cravat undone, his hair wild, holding his pistol with white-knuckled desperation. Suddenly, a heavy, rhythmic thudding echoed from the grand staircase. All eyes turned upward. Stumbling down the marble steps, clutching his ribs and bleeding profusely from a split lip, was O'Bannon. The hulking brute looked as though he had gone 10 rounds with a bear. "O'Bannon," Edmund barked, relief briefly flashing across his face. "Where in God's name have you been? Where is the Duchess?" O'Bannon reached the bottom of the stairs and collapsed against a marble pillar, gasping for air. His eyes were wide, glassy, and filled with a horror that eclipsed even Arbuthnot's. "Dead," O'Bannon wheezed, spitting a mouthful of blood onto the pristine floor. "He ain't dead, Governor. The Duke. He's a demon. Woke right up while you was talking." Tossed me like a rag doll. A deathly silence fell over the foyer. The remaining 4 guards exchanged terrified glances, instinctively backing away from the Viscount. "You drunken imbecile," Edmund hissed, his face draining of color. "He is a vegetable. He has brain fever." "Vegetables don't punch like anvils, Carlyle," O'Bannon roared, his fear morphing into rage. "He's alive. And the Duchess, she laid me out with solid brass. They're both alive. And they're loose in this house. I'm leaving. You don't pay enough to fight dead men walking." O'Bannon staggered toward the front doors. "Stand your ground!" Edmund screamed, leveling his pistol at the brute's broad back. "I will shoot you for desertion, O'Bannon." Before O'Bannon could reach the heavy iron bolts, a sound pierced the thick oak doors, a sound that made Edmund's blood run colder than any ghost story. It was the sharp, piercing blast of a cavalry bugle, followed by the thunderous, synchronized stampede of dozens of heavy hooves charging up the gravel driveway. "Open the gates in the name of the King's Magistrate," a booming, authoritative voice commanded from the other side of the courtyard. Cecilia let out a ragged breath, leaning her forehead against the wooden balustrade. "Finnegan made it. Lord Covington is here." Edmund spun around, his eyes wild, realizing the noose had finally tightened around his neck. "Barricade the doors," he screamed at the guards. "Do not let them in!" "If Covington sees the ledgers, we are all dead." But the guards were done following the orders of a doomed man. They dropped their halberds and scattered like rats, fleeing toward the servant quarters and the rear exits, desperate to escape the wrath of the King's dragoons. "Cowards!" Edmund shrieked. He looked frantically around the empty foyer, realizing he was entirely alone. He bolted toward the drawing room, desperate to reach the burning fireplace to destroy the forged promissory notes he kept in his coat pocket. Leopold stood up from his crouching position on the mezzanine. He looked at Cecilia, his eyes burning with a fierce, uncompromising resolve. "The shadows have done their work," Leopold said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "It is time to step into the light." Cecilia reached out and grasped his hand, her grip unyielding. "Finish him, Leopold. Take back our home." With a nod, Leopold pushed open the hidden door that led from the mezzanine out onto the grand landing of the main staircase. He stepped out of the darkness and into the full, brilliant glow of the foyer's crystal chandeliers. "Edmund!" Leopold's voice boomed through the cavernous hall, echoing with the absolute authority of the Duke of Westmoreland. Edmund froze mid-stride, mere feet from the drawing-room doors. Slowly, agonizingly, the Viscount turned around. When Edmund laid eyes on Leopold, standing tall at the top of the sweeping marble staircase, bruised, battered, but undeniably, terrifyingly alive, the pistol slipped from the Viscount's trembling fingers and clattered uselessly against the marble floor. "Hello, cousin," Leopold said softly, descending the stairs one deliberate step at a time. "I believe you have overstayed your welcome." The heavy oak doors of the manor splintered inward with a deafening crack. A massive iron battering ram, wielded by 6 red-coated King's dragoons, shattered the inner crossbar. The doors swung wide, admitting the freezing pre-dawn wind and a flood of armed soldiers. Leading the charge was Lord Alistair Covington, a distinguished magistrate with silver hair and an expression carved from granite. Beside him stood Captain James Mercer of the Dragoons, sword drawn and eyes sweeping the room for threats. Behind them all, shivering in a borrowed wool cloak, was Finnegan the stable boy, pointing frantically toward the center of the foyer. The military force halted in their tracks, entirely unprepared for the tableau before them. There were no ghosts, no raving madmen, no bloodbaths. There was only Edmund Carlyle, on his knees in the center of the room, his head bowed in absolute, crushing defeat. Standing over him, holding the Viscount's discarded pistol casually at his side, was Leopold Somerset. "Good God, Westmoreland," Lord Covington breathed, lowering his cane as he stepped over the splintered wood. "The boy came to my estate raving that you were a prisoner in your own home, on the brink of death. You look like you've been run over by a carriage, but you are remarkably vertical." "The carriage accident was quite real, Alistair," Leopold said, his voice steady, tossing the flintlock pistol onto a nearby velvet settee. "The coma, however, was a necessary fiction. I needed to see exactly how deep the rot in my own house went. It seems my cousin here took my temporary slumber as an opportunity to accelerate his plans for theft, forgery, and— what did you call it, Edmund? Ah, yes. Relieving the Duchess of her earthly burdens with a spare pillow, Captain Mercer gestured sharply, and 2 dragoons hauled Edmund to his feet, binding his wrists tightly with thick leather straps. The Viscount did not speak. His eyes were vacant, the realization that his life was effectively over having finally shattered his mind. "Search his pockets," Leopold commanded the soldiers. "You will find a stack of forged promissory notes drawn on the Bank of England. In the library, you will find a half-signed death certificate, courtesy of Dr. Arbuthnot, whom I suggest you apprehend before he reaches a port city. And if you check the ledgers in my study, Alistair, you will find evidence that Edmund has been skimming the northern coal revenues for 3 years, blaming the deficits on my fictitious gambling debts." Lord Covington's face darkened with fury. "Treason, forgery, and attempted murder of a peer. Take him to the carriages, Captain. The gallows at Newgate will be swinging before the month is out." As the soldiers dragged a silent, broken Edmund out into the cold morning air, Leopold finally let his rigid posture collapse. The adrenaline that had sustained him for the past 6 hours evaporated, leaving behind a crushing wave of physical agony. His bruised ribs screamed, and the gash on his temple throbbed with a renewed, vicious tempo. He swayed slightly, reaching out to grip the marble banister for support. Before he could fall, a warm, steady presence was at his side. Cecilia had descended the staircase, her silk dressing gown ruined by dust and soot, her hair falling in wild tangles around her shoulders. She slipped her arm around his waist, taking his weight without a word, anchoring him to the earth just as she had anchored his estate in his absence. Lord Covington approached the couple, removing his hat in a gesture of profound respect. "Your Grace," he addressed Cecilia, bowing deeply. "The boy Finnegan told me of your courage. To hold off a mercenary force and summon the law. You are a woman of formidable mettle. The Duke is a fortunate man." "The Duke is a very foolish man, Lord Covington," Cecilia replied, her tone perfectly polite but carrying an undercurrent of steel. She did not look at Leopold, but he is, at the very least, a resilient one. Covington smiled a grim, knowing smile. "I shall leave a dozen men to secure the perimeter and track down the deserters. I will return tomorrow with the clerks to formalize the charges. Rest, both of you. You have earned the dawn." As the magistrate took his leave, the massive manor finally fell truly silent. The terrifying, suffocating quiet of the past 3 days was gone, replaced by the peaceful stillness of a storm that had finally broken. Leopold and Cecilia stood alone at the foot of the grand staircase. The first pale rays of the morning sun began to pierce the high, arched windows of the foyer, casting long, golden shafts of light across the marble floor. Leopold looked down at his wife. The anger in her eyes had faded, replaced by an exhaustion so profound it seemed to sink into her bones. "Cecilia," he whispered, his voice cracking with an emotion he had suppressed for years. He turned to face her, gently taking her hands in his. They were covered in soot and bruised from the candelabra, the hands of a warrior. "I know an apology is a pathetic offering for what I put you through. I let my pride and my cynicism build a wall between us. I listened to the poison of society instead of looking at the extraordinary woman standing right in front of me." She looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his face. She did not immediately offer forgiveness. She was too honest for such easy platitudes. "You broke my heart, Leopold," she said softly. the raw honesty of her words cutting deeper than any blade Edmund could have wielded. "When I thought you were dying, I realized I was mourning the man I met in my father's library, a man I thought was already gone. And then, when I realized you were awake, when I realized you were testing me, I hated you. I truly did." Leopold swallowed hard, accepting the judgment. "I know, and I will spend the rest of my days proving to you that the man from the library is not dead. I will not ask for your forgiveness today, Cecilia. I only ask that you do not leave. Let me earn my place by your side. Let me be the partner you actually deserve, the partner who fights the wolves with you." In the light, a long, agonizing silence stretched between them, filled only by the soft ticking of the grand-grandfather clock. Slowly, Cecilia let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for 3 days. She reached up, her thumb gently brushing the dried blood away from the cut on his temple. The touch was achingly tender, a stark contrast to the violence of the night. "The estate is a mess, Leopold," she murmured, a faint, exhausted ghost of a smile touching her lips. "The servants need to be rehired, the ledgers need to be officially audited, and we have a shattered washstand in the master bedroom." Leopold felt a profound, overwhelming surge of hope. He pulled her gently against his chest, burying his face in her hair, inhaling the scent of jasmine and gunpowder. "Then we shall rebuild it," he whispered fiercely. "All of it." As the morning sun fully breached the windows, bathing the shattered foyer in brilliant, warm light, the Duke and Duchess of Westmoreland stood together. The shadows of betrayal and deceit had been driven back into the walls, leaving behind a foundation built not on aristocratic arrangement, but on the unshakable bedrock of truth, forged in the fires of survival. The scandalous events of the Westmoreland inheritance attempt became the stuff of legend within the high society of 19th-century England. Viscount Edmund Carlisle was convicted of high treason and forgery, spending his final days in the cold stone of Newgate prison before meeting the hangman's noose, forever serving as a grim warning to ambitious second sons. Dr. Horace Arbuthnot was apprehended in Dover, his reputation ruined, living out his days in absolute disgrace. As for Leopold and Cecilia, the trauma of the carriage accident and the subsequent siege did not destroy their union. It resurrected it. The Duke, shedding his former cynical aloofness, became a progressive champion of the House of Lords, his political maneuvers matched only by the brilliant, quiet statesmanship of his Duchess. Their marriage, once a fragile arrangement of convenience, transformed into a formidable partnership of absolute equals, remembered in history not for its scandalous near end, but for its magnificent, unyielding endurance.